Thank you all for coming. My name is Robert Harrison. I have taken over the directing of this Another Look book series from the founder of the series, which is Tobias Wolff, well known to most of you here. He's going to be one of our discussants tonight. And we have, along with Tobias, we have Alita Hayes, whom I'll introduce more formally in a moment. I was meant to ask how many of you are not on the on our mailing list? Yeah. Okay.
It's going around.
It's going around. Good. One other announcement: we do have a book for the winter meeting, which is outside on the desk there. It's by the Czech writer Hrabal, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Bohumil Hrabal. It's a short little novel, beautiful, exquisite novel called Too Loud a Solitude. We don't have a date exactly, but we're also too late to get into the continuing studies catalog for the winter. So I would ask all of you to make sure you're on the email list so that you get a reminder and you get the information about the participants and the exact date. So we're looking forward to that in the winter. Tonight we're going to be discussing this very interesting novel by Zora Neale Hurston. This is a novel that I discovered, I don't know exactly how many years ago, but we have a program at Stanford for the freshmen. It used to be called IHUM before it was dismantled, and now it's called Thinking Matters. And in the pilot course for this new IHUM program, Professor Harry Elam, Professor Keith Baker, and myself co-taught a course to about 250 students, and each of us brought a few books into the syllabus. And Harry Elam was the one who actually proposed Their Eyes Were Watching God. It's a book I had not read before, and I was so taken with that narrative at the time and found so many things to discover about it that were quite unexpected, that it became the book that I wanted to give lectures on, no? Whereas Harry Elam was very taken with the Persian letters of Montesquieu, and so we had an exchange where he lectured on Montesquieu's the Persian letters, so it all worked out very well, and I was delighted to revisit and reread Their Eyes Were Watching God for tonight's occasion. And I'm looking forward to our discussion because we're going to be talking about the novel in particular, but we're also going to be talking about Zora Neale Hurston herself, and she has a very interesting, fascinating, and somewhat controversial biography. She was on the wrong side of the political divide in the 30s and 40s and into the 50s. She had a strange, idiosyncratic sort of politics, to put it, crudely, where she embraced positions that seemed very counterintuitive for a black woman at the time, but for which she had a number of very well-reasoned positions. I'd like to read you, just to give you a sense of that voice of hers when it comes to some of her more controversial stances on the issue of being black. This comes from a piece that she wrote well before she wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God in 1928-29. It's called How It Feels to Be Colored Me. And there she writes about growing up in Eatonville, which was the only all-black incorporated town in the United States. Eatonville is also the town that we have in Their Eyes Were Watching God. And she did not realize until she was 13 that she was actually colored, no? She said, but changes came in the family when I was 13, and I was sent to school in Jacksonville. I left Eatonville, the town of the Oleanders, as Zora. When I disembarked from the riverboat at Jacksonville, she was no more. It seemed that I had suffered a sea change. I was not Zora of Orange County anymore. I was now a little colored girl. I found it out in certain ways. In my heart as well as in the mirror, I became a fast brown, warranted not to rub nor run. And then she goes on, but I am not tragically colored. There is no great sorrow dammed up in my soul, nor lurking behind my eyes. I do not mind at all. I do not belong to the sobbing school of Negrohood who hold that nature somehow has given them a low-down, dirty deal, and whose feelings are all hurt about it. Even in the helter-skelter skirmish that is my life, I have seen that the world is to the strong, regardless of a little pigmentation more or less. No, I do not weep at the world. I am too busy sharpening my oyster knife. And with your permission, I'll continue a little. Someone is always at my elbow reminding me that I am the granddaughter of slaves. It fails to register depression with me. Slavery is 60 years in the past. The operation was successful, and the patient is doing well, thank you. And these are statements that are still, largely very difficult to countenance for many. And it explains the degree to which she was extremely controversial in her own lifetime, especially with writers like Richard Wright and Langston Hughes, these people who had a militant commitment to the cause of being black. And for her to go on to say, the terrible struggle that made me an American out of a potential slave said, on the line. The Reconstruction said, get set, and the generation before said, go. I am off to a flying start, and I must not halt in the stretch to look behind and weep. Slavery is the price I paid for civilization. That's an explosive line that many people always go back and cite as something that she really should not have said, even her strongest supporters. But I think that the point that she was making from what I'm reading here is that it's a bully adventure and worth all that I have paid through my ancestors for it. No one on earth ever had a greater chance for glory, the world to be won and nothing to be lost. It is thrilling to think, to know that for any act of mine I shall get twice as much praise or twice as much blame. And it is quite exciting to hold the center of the national stage with the spectators not knowing whether to laugh or to weep. And of course, this kind of highly uninhibited expression of her views about what it meant to be black, or colored as she called it, explains to a certain extent this strange sort of fluctuation in her stock quota, if I can use that analogy, where in the 30s, early 40s, she was really the most famous, most well-known black woman writer of her time, novelist, and highly celebrated. And then after one kind of corrosive attack after another, she faded into a kind of oblivion and found it harder and harder to get her work published. And eventually, she ended up becoming a maid and then going on into a town where she ended her life really in complete obscurity with all her books out of print. And for about 30 years, she was consigned to a kind of oblivion, and she was resurrected thanks to, in large part, to Alice Walker, who, having read Their Eyes Were Watching God, the book that we're reading tonight, found it shocking that when she read that she was buried, was Zora Neale Hurston in an unmarked grave, and undertook a pilgrimage to find that grave in a segregated cemetery down in Florida, and to put a headstone on that grave, indicating that here was a Southern genius, novelist, and anthropologist. And when she published that account of her pilgrimage in Miss Magazine, I believe it was in the mid-70s, this led to a rediscovery of Zora Neale Hurston, and now Their Eyes Were Watching God is, one of the most read books, certainly in the university curriculum, And it has, and I think that in our discussion tonight, we're going to see the extent to which some of these attitudes about her attitude towards the Black vernacular, about the autonomy of the Black community and so forth, that it's going to lead, I'm sure, to a very interesting discussion with our participants. So Tobias Wolff doesn't need much introduction, no, but you all know him as one of our premier novelists and short story writers here in America, a national treasure, as it were. I would go and read, from the whole list of books and accomplishments, but I don't think I'll take that time because everyone knows who Tobias Wolff is, and Cynthia Haven has also put all the information necessary on our website. Alida Hayes, I would like to say a few words about because I've gotten to know Alida just in the last 6 to 8 months. And she is a contemporary dancer and choreographer, performer, and lecturer in the Department of Drama here at Stanford. And before her appointment here at Stanford, she taught for 8 years at Princeton in the program of theater and dance and the program in African American Studies. She's also taught at Wesleyan University, Swarthmore College, Rutgers. She holds an MFA in dance and choreography from New York NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, and a BA in drama, dance, and the visual arts here at Stanford, where she was an undergraduate. So it's a bit of a homecoming. Before she came back to Stanford, she lived for 15 years in New York, choreographing solo and group dance pieces, and her performances have involved a lot of acting and singing. She's also had leading roles in major works by other artists, in particular the great American stage director and playwright Robert Wilson. She performed in Robert Wilson's directed opera, The Temptation of St. Anthony, which is rooted in the gospel tradition and other African American spiritual musical forms. Since returning to Stanford in 2004 on a Ford Foundation Residence Dialogue Fellowship through the Committee on Black Arts Performing, Alida has continued to develop what's the critic Anna Gisselgoff has called the theater of mixed forms, often collaborating with student, low-income, racially mixed neighborhoods to create and perform a montage of music and monologue. And she's involved in a number of other very interesting endeavors, which I just learned tonight earlier before we came here, that she's also on November 9th going to be doing some kind of called a palimpsest at Robley Gym, or what used to be known as Robley Gym, that will take the whole history of this particular building here on the Stanford campus and turn it into a performance with the band that she founded called the Chocolate Heads. So we're looking forward to that on November 9th. So Alida, I think I'm going to ask you to go first, and you don't necessarily have to come here to the microphone. We can just sit there and conduct our conversation from the table.
Good evening. Good evening. Wow. I just want to acknowledge Cynthia Haven, who invited me here tonight because she thought I might have something to add to this conversation. So I just want to acknowledge that. And my friend Elaine Ray, who I've had a conversation with about this book. So I just start out this way. Walk in the light, beautiful light. Come where the dewdrops of mercy shine bright. Fall all around us by day or by night. Jesus, the light of the world. We will walk in the light, beautiful light. Come where the dewdrops of mercy shine bright. Fall all around us by day or by night. Jesus, the light of the world. So I saw that song in the book where Joe Starks is sending people out to get the biggest pine tree. No, 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 it's got to be perfect. It's got to be straighter, because people are kind of like, why do we need a street lamp or whatever? And he realizes, no, I'm going to make an occasion out of it. And then, he like tells the men, yes, and I'm going to get a hog. Who else is going to get a hog? And people went out and got a hog, and the men were kind of, and barbecuing all night long, and the women were making their pies and showing off. And then it was like an occasion to put light. And I just thought about, that reminds me so much of African American retentions that have continued up until this day. My church that I go to, Jerusalem Baptist Church, it's a mirror or a continuation of that energy. And like we just had a competition in our church regionally where people made food from the South, all the foods from the South, but like it's called, the North, and there's the governor of the northern states, and then Louisiana, of course, the South, the South end, then Louisiana had its own thing, Texas had its own thing, and it was the competition, and people came and judged and ate and laughed really loud and told stories. And this was a church, activity. And I am considered kind of a young one in that church. There are great grandkids who are young, but I'm like considered young. Everybody's like 80 and 90. And I go there for two reasons. I go there to worship, but I also go there because it's a world that's going away, and I don't want to miss it. I don't want to miss it. I was just talking to Elaine. There's a woman there that named Lurleen Thomas. I think that's what her name is. And she like raised a solo. She's 99. And the woman who accompanied her is 89. And when she got up, people were like, go on now. And it made me think of a lot of scenes in that book. And then I started thinking about my family. The way they sit around the corner, on the corner and talk about people and signify and call each other out in this way that it can be a little mean, but it's got to be funnier than it is mean, which is the way that African Americans do it. Or the way people, like my uncles, the way they play bid whist and they get up and I forgot what scene it was, and they throw it down and say these words, and it's all a performance and singing. And what I saw about Zora Neale Hurston is how much she loved African American culture. She loved it. And this book was a way to put it in. And then I found out that a lot of the characters and the stories were based on her own life. Her father had been the mayor of Eatonville. God, oh my goodness. I mean, I can hear him right now. Even though he wasn't a preacher, he had that, I'm a judge, the preacher, the mayor. That's what moved me about Zora Neale Hurston. And then I was talking to them earlier also about the language and the music of the language. And I realized that is something that, I'm a dance person, so I was just telling them that I spent like a whole lot of years looking at what people did, not what they said. And somebody told me in one of these universities, no, actually you also have to listen to what they're saying. But I was like, but what if what they're saying is different from what they're doing? And you were like, that doesn't matter. You have to still listen, put those things together. It's like, And so how I've come back to it is the music of language. So I reread this novel for this event out loud to myself. And that's very quickly, even when I didn't understand the references, all these references that are biblical or whatever they are, different kind of colloquialisms, I understood them when I read them aloud in context. It's like I became a character in that. And when I did that, I realized, yes, there's Janie, and there's that story, which is based on her own life. She fell in love with a young man. And as I said, her father was like Joe Starks. And she also had a loveless marriage. But I saw myself in Zora Neale Hurston. She's a little loud. She says things that people go, in this environment. You know? She's an artist scholar. And she loves African American culture. And I got that from my parents. Yeah, I got that from my parents. So what's interesting now is somebody like me doesn't go to a Jerusalem Baptist church. They go to an integrated church where there's nothing wrong with that. But it's a different environment. The other thing I just want to mention that's is talking about the relationship to white people in that book. You know, that the whole idea, the positive, the white people that she didn't even know that she was a black, and then you see how she had that same thing in her own lifetime. Talking about good white folks, when they know you, they can be good to you, kind of idea. And then how all that poor whites and blacks work together. So the doctor could be a friend because he knew them, whereas the people in the city didn't know him, and so that was dangerous. And then that one comment I wanted to get to hear from you later on about the only free people are white men and black women. I'm interested to hear what people think about that idea. So the thing that most moved me about Janie and Zora Neale Hurston is that urge to be free. Preferably with somebody, but even without. Which is universal. It's not just African American, but that's a very powerful impulse. And yet to want to, and to look for love. So the thing that slayed me, which I'm sure, she was stretched on her back beneath the pear tree, soaking in the alto chant of the visiting bees, the gold of the sun, and the panting breath of the breeze when the inaudible voice of it all came to her. She saw a dust-bearing bee sink into the sanctum of a bloom. The thousand sister calyxes arched to meet the love embrace, and the ecstatic shiver of the tree from root to tiniest branch, creaming in every blossom and frothing with delight. So this is a marriage. She just didn't give up on that. She wanted that, and she's gonna get it.
All right. I have plenty of follow-up questions. I'm going to hold off, though. Toby?
Thank you for that, Aleda, for singing that song. When I came across it in here, I wondered how it would sound. Now I know. Like probably most of you in here, I read the book some years ago for the first time, and the images, so many of the images have stayed with me over the years. Just the very opening of all the women, the chorus, if you will, commenting on Janie as she comes back, and thinking in their collaboration of gossip to bring her down to size. The picture of Tea Cake trying to save her from that rabid dog during the flood. It's almost surreal. It's extraordinary. It's like an image out of Bosch or something. And images like that, and that scene in the kitchen when Tea Cake, who has in essence sacrificed himself to save her, she now must kill him to save herself. This compass rose of ironies in the book, just absolutely striking. And her life really is of great interest. She could have, we were talking about this a little at dinner, I would like to think and I would hope that her work, even without an intervention by Alice Walker, would have come back to us. But this, she was, in spite of all the arguments which, attended her ideas about writing, her political ideas, she was, first and last, a writer. I think of Auden's lines, time that is intolerant of the brave and innocent and indifferent in a week to a beautiful physique, worships language and forgives everyone by whom it lives. And she certainly lived by it. Just the opening, if I just read the opening paragraph here. Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some they come in with the tide. For others they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing until the watcher turns his eyes away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. That is the life of men. That could have been the last paragraph of the book as well. Another thing that really strikes me again in the rereading of it is this sort of independence of mind that she exhibited to the irritation of some in her outlook, her political kind of cultural outlook, gets a really vibrant expression in this book. Her picture of the, you say she loved her cultures. Yes, she did. And it's celebrated here without the more conventional depiction of a community, of an African American community in tension with a violent relationship or an aggrieved relationship with a more dominant white community. That is the conventional and certainly truthful, certainly a truthful picture. She is more interested in saying, just how does this community live on its own? It defines itself and needn't be defined always in this other way. And I love the way she looks at that and allows that community to define itself without idealizing it. Because all the oppressions that we know are out there, we get glimpses of them in the, in Nanny's masters taking advantage of her, exercising his droit de seigneur, the men with their rifles after the flood rounding up African American men to bury the dead, the white judges and jury at the end of the book sitting in judgment on her. That power is out there. We sense it at the periphery. But the decisive community of this book, it defines itself. It is the relationships of these people that she is interested in and celebrates in a way that is complex, because they supply, as we do in our communities, all the oppression anybody needs themselves. Think of her first husband, and beating her, treating her like property, thinking he did her a big favor by marrying her. And this gets reenacted. It seems such an escape for her to go off with Jody, and the same thing begins to reenact itself. And we start thinking back to that life that Nanny wanted her to have, to not be, as Nanny puts, black women are the mules of this world. She didn't want Janie to be a mule, and Janie will not be a mule. And but there are oppressors and judges even within that community, who have more, in a sense, powerful voices to determine their destinies than that must be struggled against. That, again, that chorus of judges as she comes back into town, of her own people sitting in judgment as she comes back. So as much as she celebrates this community, she gives also a very realistic and complicated picture of it. It isn't us against them. It's kind of us against ourselves, the way we really are in all communities, and those things that we have to transcend within our own communities without necessarily reference to the one outside. And I loved her kind of single-minded determination to do that in this book. Well, I think that's probably a good place for me to leave off, except I'll just say one last thing. I will admit that I found myself having occasionally, though the language has great poetry, and I think reading it aloud is probably a very good way to read this book. I did find myself having to push through the dialect a lot. And I'm not alone in this. Even Richard Wright had difficulties in reading it, and even criticized it as being in a kind of instance of a sort of blackface prose, a minstrelsy, if you will, that she was putting on. He says he accused her of parading this dialect for a white audience, to please a white audience. I think that's a very complicated question about this book. My own sense is that she was determined to use this language as an aspect of celebrating this particular community. And even the visual appearance of that language on the page is a kind of statement. Now, the word was, for example, is pronounced the same whether you write it W-A-S or W-U-Z. But it is the appearance of that word on the page which is continually returning you to that community. She knew what she was doing. It's an assertion. Whether it always works is another question which we can no doubt take up here. But maybe that's a place to leave off.
So I would have a few questions to raise for us. Those of you who've read the introduction by Mary Ellen Washington, and then there's a postword by Henry Gates and Louise Gates. There's all this emphasis. The typical reading of the novel is that it's all about Janie finding her voice, no? And rereading the book this time, I had to come to the conclusion that Janie finding her voice is just one of the motifs in which the voice doesn't belong just to this protagonist. Mm-hmm. It's the voice that the author, Zora Neale Hurston, has managed to put into play as the oral culture that is part of that community that she's writing about. And so we get to hear in their own voices, as it were, through that, for us, sometimes awkward spelling and so forth. But we get to hear folk tales of the tradition, of personal stories, and that her characters relate. The kind of courting rituals, part of that society, speeches, sermons, and so forth. There's a great many voices in this polyphonic kind of narrative. And Janie's search to find her own voice, I think it gets disseminated into Zora Neale Hurston's attempt to bring a plurality of voices out in the open that would have been impossible had she not undertaken years of actual anthropological work in the fields. We didn't mention yet that she studied, Barnard and Franz Boas, the great anthropologists at the time, and collected a great deal of folklore and folk music and traditions and so forth in the southern states of the United States. She was also in Haiti when she wrote this book, studying Haitian rituals and voodoo and folklore. She wrote it in 7 weeks, apparently, which to me is astonishing.
Yeah.
And yeah, her voice is important. So open question whether she does really find that voice. As far as I can tell, she tells Phoebe at the end that she should go and tell those women on the porch what she's just narrated and let it become a communal kind of story, some kind of be part of the community. So I think there's been a little bit overemphasis from what I can tell in focus just on the main character. I don't know what you think, Alida, about that.
I absolutely agree with that. In fact, it's really almost like she's using the thread of that story and finding the voice, you said it very well, to showcase all these other voices. It's almost like being the straight man or the cipher into which all, that gets threaded through that. And it's very interesting that somebody is quote unquote looking for their voice while all these other voices are helping to bring it out. So I definitely agree with that.
Yeah. I wouldn't have much to add to that. I think that's true. I think maybe speaking of someone finding their own voice is a way also of forging their own identity, which she is determined to do in this, and in the face of the control of her husbands and lover and her and the circumstances of her life. She's pushing against that all the time, yeah, absolutely.
So Toby, you mentioned Nanny saying that she doesn't want Janie to grow up as a mule.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by the image that stayed with me over the years since I last read it was Jody Starkey, the mayor, buying that mule for $5 from, what's his name? I think his name is Matt.
Matt, yeah.
Matt. And setting that mule free.
Yeah.
Which is such a powerful symbol of a certain kind of liberation that, and then I think the most beautiful instance of Jenny's own voice is when she does this little eulogy of him, where she says that you've done something that is like presidential, or it's Lincoln, or this is a great kind of historical thing that he's done. It is a powerful symbol insofar as the mule is set free and liberated.
But she isn't.
Well, she isn't, right. So
I love that whole section about the mule. That is so inventive and funny. I mean, the way the town wits play on poor Matt's head with this mule and say, I just happened to be walking by and I saw the women down there by the river using your mule as a washerboard because its ribs are sticking up so much. And every time they see him, they have come up with something else like this. And maybe it was just to shut them up that Jody bought that mule. But I love what happens afterwards. The mule just becomes a town mule. He kind of wanders around, and even children bring him fodder now and then. And it's such an irony that that Jody, who is, like a lid on Janie, commanding her to wear the head scarf always in the store and finding fault with everything she does, would set the mule free.
But that he made himself popular because he knows people didn't like him. Okay, they were a little bit like, behind his back, like, there he goes. They respected him, but they didn't like him. And he saw the response when he set the mule free, that he made himself human. So he wasn't then just one-dimensional. He was somebody that did do something for the town and, got a post office and did all kinds of things, but also he could see that people didn't like him.
Right.
And he made himself liked. And then she uses that to tell all those mule stories, which are like a kind of a folklore. Mm-hmm. So that's how it becomes really like allegory, or this whole other level that she deals with in terms of what she's writing, to use those mule stories like that. Because it's very unreal. I mean, do they give a funeral to the mule? Maybe, but you just know what I'm saying? I'm sure it's in the folklore about, the mule having a funeral. Sure. And all of that.
Well, in fact, her main work of anthropological research is called Mules and Men.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
so the mule was, always very present in her mind.
Yeah, that's right.
So, Alida, let me ask you this question, because, being a male of my own gender, as Woody Allen calls it, I don't like taking a shower in front of men of my own gender. But it's impossible not to have a certain shudder of anxiety with respect to this, main protagonist of the story, because she, and I'm not condemning or judging. I'm just querying, the history of, someone who marries Logan, leaves without divorcing, marries Starks, and ends up on his deathbed, basically damning him to death, and without any sense of clemency for the occasion. And there's a suggestion that she hastens or some way. And then Tea Cake is supposed to be the great love of her life, but at the same time, Tea Cake has his own faults. And I know that he, as Toby said, he sacrificed himself to save her, during the floods. He got bit by a rabid dog, and as a result, but we're left with this fact that she loved Tea Cake to death, killing him in the final analysis, really, to save herself. And it raises the question of whether whether her freedom, as she conceives it at the beginning of the story, under the pear tree, this idea of love, whether that kind of freedom is at all compatible with a relationship at all, at least with a man of my own gender, as they say.
Huh.
Well, what's interesting about that, and so that's where we get away from color completely, right?
Right.
Because
It's a
it's
different
not
issue.
it's not about that, and so you can see how those fears could be played out in all kinds of ways.
Absolutely.
I just want to go to TK first because she did love him to death. They loved each other to death, and he would have killed her because he was gone.
Right.
But he's a young man. She married a young man.
And what do you see the significance
He was
of that?
immature.
That he was.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if he hadn't been young and immature, she wouldn't have loved him to the same extent, right?
No, he saw they had something. They had a simpatico that was beyond the age thing. I really think that was true. And it was, I learned, yes, that she had her own young man.
Yeah.
So she was kind of working that out.
Right.
And then in terms of the first two men, that's right. They were both, and this is not uncommon even now, these marriages of convenience, or a grandmother that says, no, you're going to get married because we're not going to spoil this deal. You're going to, and I don't want you to live the way,
Go ahead.
No, no, what?
No, nothing.
No,
No.
what? No, really.
No, please.
No,
I wasn't
I
going to interrupt.
know.
Toby?
But I don't think she was, also she wasn't condemning him. She was trying to, he was convinced she put some roots on him.
Well,
So
I
she
know.
was like, he didn't, she would have at least helped him, but he was convinced she was trying to kill him. He was
Right.
convinced of that.
He was trying to kill her.
Yeah,
he was
he was.
obviously out of it.
He was crazy.
But she could have chosen a
point.
different way to tell the story of this young woman, that it doesn't have to end with her killing off the man that is supposed to represent the fulfillment of the of the
But
love
then it
wish
wouldn't
at
be
the beginning.
tragedy.
But does it have to? Yeah, okay, that's a good answer. But does it?
Are you talking about the way it's written? That is Zora Neale Hurston's construction of the narrative, or do you mean
The fact
that
that
is
she-
not the way that Janie herself had to tell the story and end it?
Well, I don't know. I guess the question I'm asking is what's revealed about Tea Cake through his behavior in this rabid state doesn't actually bring out something that is in him latently, which is jealousy, or kind of
Right.
insane jealousy and possessiveness. All her previous men had that same characteristic. He does beat her at a certain point, steals her money, but then he apologizes. So he has, as you were saying, Toby, this is not an idealized man. This is a very
Flawed.
yeah.
Yeah, and I also wonder. Yes, they did love each other in an utterly compromised human way, but you know, when they go off together and he gets up and takes her money, it was just by luck, really, that he managed not to lose it all, and that he was able to come back. Let's say he'd lost it all. Would he actually have come back to her then, to tell her that I took all your money and lost it? So there's, you know, the love is very conditional, as in all human relationships, and in their you know, in the way that Hurston has drawn it. I think and I don't think that the ending really is that this madness that comes upon Tea Cake because of the bite of this rabid dog. I don't think that she meant to show something about him that was native to him. I mean, it is to everybody. I mean, we all have a potential for violence, but clearly he's not responsible at the end for himself. Seems to me.
Yeah, no, it's clinically he's exempt from.
Yeah.
But the choice has been made that he expresses this the same sort of possessiveness and desire to control. Well, I'll tell you why where I find the redemption. This is an image, or it's just a detail that jumped out at me on my rereading, and it's after the trial, and she's been exonerated, and it's on page 191 if anyone's interested. But the people in the Everglades, they had begged Janie to stay on with them, and she had stayed a few weeks to keep them from feeling bad, but the muck meant Tea Cake, and Tea Cake wasn't there, so it was just a great expanse of black mud. And that black mud, of course, is the earth in its uncultivated state, but it's also, I think, potential. So she had given away everything in their little house except a package of garden seed that Tea Cake had bought to plant. The planting never got done because he had been waiting for the right time of the moon when his sickness overtook him. The seeds reminded Janie of Tea Cake more than anything else because he was always planting things. She had noticed them on the kitchen shelf when she came home from the funeral and had put them in her breast pocket. Now that she was home, she meant to plant them for remembrance. And here again, I'm maybe expanding the symbol beyond what its intention, but I have a feeling that this novel, in certain sense, is a flowering of those seeds that Janie brings home and tells the story, you know, to that community, and that community then, something grows out of this remembrance, and that this is Tea Cake's kind of legacy, or it's his way, his kind of organic afterlife in her.
Well, her friend Phoebe was like inspired. She was gonna tell her husband to take her fishing or something. Like, so it was already. She said, and go out and tell. Yes, go out and tell what it's felt like, whatever it is, to have tried to be free, and to be free.
And the whole idea of this, of things growing and coming into bloom, which those seeds carry with them, returns us to that beautiful first image of the bee, and you know, the whole idea of that idea of, you know, of marriage that she gets, you know, and also it's very physical, and you feel the person actually coming into a physical consciousness of themselves and of herself in that scene. That's that, you know, this is returning us to, I think.
What do you think? Shall we turn it over to our guests? Yes.
Yippee!
Can you take the microphone? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And this was a remarkable novel. And I have so many things responding to what you said. First of all, this is a novel from the early part of the 20th century, and it's set in history. And these people remember slavery. And that comes out very well in the beginning when they go into this town and find it's not built, and the men are lying there on their shoulder blades. And there's just a little comment there about work, and to them, work meant slavery. And you realize that there's this connection between work and slavery that they had, that I've never read anywhere else. A statement like that, so profound. But also, I think the woman Jamie has confidence from the beginning. She's a woman who's navigating her life and manipulating her life in the best way she can. She's had to resist all of these forces all this time, and she manages to navigate. She doesn't speak back to Joe. She has learned that doesn't work for her. And so she suppresses it, but she doesn't have choices. Also, it's an incredible feminist novel. I mean, Hurston's feminist consciousness I just looked, the copyright is 1937, so it was written maybe in the 20s, the 30s, I don't know when. But she has feminist consciousness at a time when feminism was hardly a word. It hadn't only been invented in the last 50 years. And yet she can write about a woman and gender. I mean, she writes about gender relationships in a way that is very sensitive and very sympathetic to her. And the grandmother, Nanny, knew this and was the source of trying to teach Janie how to navigate in this world that was going to be against her in so many ways and trying to protect her in so many ways. I also think it's written with incredible confidence for a young woman to have written this novel. And so, anyway, that's it. No questions, just comments.
Thank you.
Elaine, you don't have anything to say?
Just going to put me on the spot.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to. Yes, thank you.
Well, I just have a question. How old was she when she wrote it?
She was born in 91. It was published in 37, so she was 46 when it was published, and she had written it not long before then.
Over here.
I'd like to ask what you think of her having written this in 7 weeks. What do you imagine were the preconditions that allowed her to do that? And have you ever written anything this long in 7 weeks?
I haven't ever written anything short in 7 weeks. I don't know. Gatsby was written in quite a burst, also, matter of months, and this sort of thing goes on, and I can only look on from a distance, like the watcher watching the ship on the horizon, you know, and you know most writers. Thank God, don't embarrass me by finishing things in 7 weeks that, you know, when I'm sitting in there for years. But some do. I mean, Joyce Carol Oates has probably finished a novel even as we've been speaking tonight, and a good one. It's not fair, but that's how it is.
Professor Rickford.
So, you know, I had, thank you. I had used excerpts from this in a couple of my classes, but not really read the whole work. And I was struck, at least as you were talking, by the whole sense of the love of African American culture. And it reminded me to some extent of August Wilson, who began writing. I had the pleasure of interviewing him here at Ujima years ago, and he said he used to write in a very high-flown language. He says, you know, terror comes over the night like a hawk, you know. And he said his novels, his plays never went anywhere. And he started listening to people in his Hill Street community in Pittsburgh, and just listening to the cadences, and he started to put that language into his plays, and he said the character started speaking and he couldn't shut him up, and of course he went on to write, he became a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner and so on and so forth. The difference is that Zora Neale Hurston is writing in the style of Paul Laurence Dunbar, a lot of the older people, where she tries not only to indicate everything about how it's to be pronounced, but then she has a lot of this I dialect that you were talking about. Was WZ, TUH for two, so that every word almost becomes a hurdle. A lot of the modern writers in dialect, including Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, August Wilson, they don't do that. They do a lot of the syntax. Her syntax is fantastic. I mean, she has all the modern features of African American English done, the absence of the copula. It's a very historically important piece of work, because there's some people who think that those things were only invented later in the 20th century, and she shows us that they were around. But it's hard to read because she tries to indicate every comma, every dot, every apostrophe. But if you can get over that, I like your idea of reading it out loud. Yeah. This is actually the kind of book that would do well with books on tape or something like that.
Yeah. I actually have an idea to have a live reading, not all in one night, and that after, maybe it would be marked out ahead of time, and people would just read parts of the book out loud, and we could do it over a period of time. Wouldn't that be cool?
Yes.
Yeah, it would be.
I don't know. Oh, look at all these people.
I got handed a microphone, so right up to my mouth. Okay. I also feel like I could talk a long time about this book, but I will try not to. Again, this book club has given me something to treasure that I may not have found on my own. So again, thank you. Unlike most of the people in this room, I grew up in the South. I grew up in the rural South in the 60s. This voice I heard throughout my childhood. It was before the shooting started. It was before the rage and the death and the narrative that has continued into this century truly began. And I am so glad this voice is here. It is beautiful. It could not be written any other way, because it is not only evidence of a way a people spoke, it is the notation on a score.
Yes.
You would not hear
Right.
was if it was spelled W-A-S. You could intellectually say, oh, I get it now, but I don't know that you do if you can't hear it, because the dialect runs and the characters run from the blues and the jazz, but it's not Dixieland jazz. This is New York urban jazz of the 30s, How do you write a saxophone growling? It's in the voices of these men who are playing cards, and the scat, and the back and the forth as they're passing the music. It is a glorious, glorious piece, and Ruby Dee did a very nice recording of it, of Books on Tape. Although I guess perhaps she's New York, because when she's narrating, what comes out quite a lot.
I just want to say that I read that it wasn't just African American dialect, it was a dialect of a particular region that whites and blacks spoke. So
But
that when you're saying that, I'm hearing you say that I recognize this completely.
And so when I learned that, and I know very little about her, but I learned that she went to school at Barnard, and I went, okay, she knows New York jazz, and she must love it, because Tea Cake is the embodiment of it. This guy jives. This guy is cool. This guy moves her. And just to speak to a man of your sex,
Gender.
of your gender, as my father-in-law told me, men don't grow up till they're 50. You're just going to have to deal with it, and she does. And I just think it's a wonderful book on many levels, and it was brought up with a friend of mine who was reading it that perhaps we should do this in the play reading group that we're in, but it's way too long. But it's a beautiful performance piece. So it's your turn now.
All right.
Yeah, I would, there's in the back here, there, Christina. Oh. Let me just add that I would say the right term for this book is bilingual, because the narrative is in a different language than the spoken dialogue. And yet what's interesting is that as the book progresses, even the narrative voice starts assuming the inflections and rhythms and tonalities of the Black vernacular that is spoken in the dialogue. So it's quite interesting how there's cross-pollination from one to another. Please.
Hi, I just wanted to make 3 main points. One, I don't feel as though Janie's voice was ever lost. It was really more of a platform for when she was to speak it, to use her voice. 2, I don't ever think that people remember that the slaves learned to speak from their masters, and the slaves were not allowed to read and write. So how was heard was how it was written. And often we are credited for this language when really it was learned and adapted from those who enslaved us. So remember that this is your language, and we adapted it to make it our language. Also, it's only a man who is concerned about a woman killing him. That's only a man's question. And I understand your question, but it's always assumed that I, as the man, when I get sick, you, as the woman in my life, will take care of me until my death, and that your life won't go on. But that you've seen many of women who have bloomed after their husbands have died, who have traveled, who have lived, who have taken young lovers and been like, well, what the hell was I missing? So I understand your concern, but know that if a woman loves herself more than she loves you, then she is living correctly.
Well.
Anybody who didn't come to the Another Look book club tonight missed something.
But you have to remember, though, the seeds are still tea cakes.
She had 2 other men before.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, who's next?
Fantastic.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could shift the discussion to the title of the book. You've already spoken a good deal about folks being judged, about oppression, about the power of the storm. The title is "Their Eyes Are Watching God," and wondering who is watching whom. What are we to make of the title?
Can I ask you, what do you think?
That's a fair question. I would say it's hard because God in this case doesn't necessarily take one form. And if you think about the spirituality of the community, it essentially revolves around people seeking to achieve a balance in the face of adversity. And when you have that take place, there's no really one place to watch anymore. You're kind of always on the lookout. So if that makes any sense, I guess I would say that, they're watching everywhere.
Well, you have to remember that line occurs in the novel to describe people who have perished in the floods, and they're dead, and their eyes are watching God insofar as they have maybe been seeking some kind of rescue, salvation, and the question is whether that God is looking back to those eyes that are watching God. And I think there's some correlation, I don't know what you think, but the mule that we were talking about earlier, when that mule dies, it doesn't die like most mules on its side. It dies facing upwards with its legs up, and so even the mule's eyes were watching God. The way those people drowned in the flood were watching God, so it's a very problematic. I think that title, she chose it, very deliberately, and I think it's hard to give any simple answer to that question.
Yeah,
If I were to make it.
I agree.
Yeah, thanks. Fantastic book. Really appreciate the discussion. Yeah, I think their eyes are watching God and God's watching back. That's my take. I loved the female-male gender politics stuff that's been unpacked a little bit. She's raised in this environment where she's given some sensibility about how to navigate and survive in that world that's not going to be easy necessarily. And we see her go through 3 relationships, and she does her best to survive and participate in the relationships even when she's not treated well. And the 3rd relationship was so interesting. She kind of falls for this guy, and then I'm thinking, well, he's a guy who sees a woman with money, and he's playing her, and is she going to fall for it? Oh no, she's going to fall for it. How can she do that? And then he goes off, and we learn about the gambling thing, and oh my goodness, he's a gambler. This is going to end badly. But she loves him, and she loves him, and she sees his value for her, and she's able to, as with the earlier relationships, live in a positive way with someone who's a human being and who's not perfect and who has liabilities. And I thought that was part of the power of the book, to tell this story, and it seemed to me to be a very female point of view. I don't know if that's universally female, but in this book it's a female point of view. And I found it extremely powerful. I too listened to the audiobook, the Ruby Dee audiobook, and it was often like listening to a piece of music. And Ruby Dee, being a kind of classical actress, she can do the narrator part and sound like a Shakespearean actor, and then do the dialogue. And I thought it was beautiful, and I think you could have a lot of fun with it in your reading series. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have in the back, or did you have a question in the back? Yeah, okay.
She already gave her the mic.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi. So I had a question about the character of Jody Starks. So he seems like a pretty complex character to me. Like, he comes off sort of arrogant and unkind, and especially in the way that he treats Jody or JD. But there's also this complexity to his character where he does a lot of good for the town. Like, he moves it forward, and he's not inherently bad character, but he doesn't really come off as a good person, at least to me. So I wanted to hear your guys' thoughts about the character and the way that this author chose to write him. Yeah, that's my question.
Mm-hmm. You know what she just says about him on his deathbed is that you were more concerned about your ambitions, the work of your hands. And so it was a loveless marriage. I don't think, one of the things they say in there, and I just wanted to bring that up, is that she was powerfully beautiful. And that was part of her ability to move and be mobile, which is something that women have done. But they ended up not really loving each other. She didn't love that. And she wanted to not be up on a pedestal. She enjoyed being on the corner laughing with people, and he didn't want that. Don't you want to class out, or what was it, class up? She was like, no.
You don't think he loved her?
He loved her like a symbol. She was beautiful, but he didn't love her. He didn't want her to talk. He just wanted her to, kind of be nice and sit there and do the right thing and take care of the store. Trophy wife. A trophy wife.
I'm sorry, I hope I remember this. Janie says that Tea Cake's got the keys to the kingdom. Do I have it right?
Mm-hmm.
And he tells her, "You're enough." That's what we're all looking. Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe it's better they didn't hear it. I probably mixed it up sadly. Janie tells Tea Cake he's got the keys to the kingdom. Do I have it right? Is that yeah? And he says, "You're enough." They've both found it. This is what we're all looking for. Not the trophy wife, not the ambition, none of it. It's just enough. It's wonderful. Anyway, that's more.
Can you hear me? Hi. Oh, was that a question? Yeah. Okay.
Is it on? Is the mic on?
Yes. How about now?
Yeah, that's better.
Hi. So going back to the question about the title, one way I read it in the context of the place where it comes up in the book, and then that quote as well, is there's a lot of seeing and waiting for God for saving and freedom and justice, but I think Zora is saying look within yourself, because you've got to go there to find it. You've got to go and look within yourself. And so I think it's sort of a commentary on that. But my question to you is, would love to hear your thought in unpacking the interplay between the oral history and identity and the corporeal, and the significance of finding both those identities in a book like this. Thank you.
I didn't understand the question.
So the question is, what would be the relationship between the corporeal and the oral dimensions of the novel, right? Yes, and the characters. And what do you mean exactly by the corporeal? The body. Yeah.
There's a lot of significance in the way the body is displayed and discussed. It's sort of its own language in a way. And so I think there is a significance in that identity that's expressed in the body, whether it's the symbolism of the wheel or the body of the places.
Yeah, so the presence of the body is seems to be, very much a part of the novel, and these are, I guess, if you don't, with your permission, I'm going to rephrase a little bit. That the question would be that these are not disembodied voices that we're hearing in the community, right? And that there's the fact that it comes with a presence that ties them to the earth and to our, materiality. So
She is just very good at describing. You can really feel the culture. You can hear the language. It's visual. And when you see them two together, you can see that culture. That's why I'm saying I thought of my uncles. I thought of the minister of the church. Uses the whole thing. It describes how the belly is way out. It's very easy. She uses everything at her disposal to bring the African American cultural expressions alive. And that she's so skilled at that. It's amazing. So it's got music, it's got physicality, it's got light, it's got color.
There's that moment, which is kind of a harbinger of Jody Stark's illness and then death, is when she notices, when Janie, who has a sharp eye, notices that he doesn't sit down, he falls into the chair. And, it's just like a hinge moment at there. Things start to change from that. So yeah, the book has a kind of palpable physicality.
we have time for a couple of more.
Oh,
Do you have a question?
Yeah. I wanted to ask a question about how writers write or artists create. She goes to Haiti. My daughter's in the Peace Corps in the Dominican Republic by the Haitian border. Still now there's not electricity all the time and not water. And here she goes to Haiti. It must be, she was working all day and then coming home, and I don't know what kind of situation she had to write. I just think it's, maybe this is what artists need to do, go away. Or writers do. This is a different aspect.
Yeah, there's also the fact that her relationship with that young man had just crashed and burned recently, and she writes this book in the wake of this failed relationship. So, So in the back, we had a,
There's one more here, and then, yes.
go ahead.
This is sort of along that lines, but it seemed like when she was little, she just thought she was African American like everybody else, and she was mulatto until someone pointed it out. And then then there was that, I don't know, that other mulatto pompous lady. But I think that she was true to herself. Sort of what she was saying before is what she wanted was the sunlight, the sunshine, and that's what TK was, even though he was so black.
Right.
And but there were so many people throughout the book that, you know, there were men who would just graze their hand on her hair or whatever just because she somehow got elevated because she was mulatto. But that's where she found her true happiness, and she always saw herself as African American. So I thought that was interesting.
Right, and that of course, it's directly pertinent to the fact that she's very fair-skinned and that she has, Mrs. Turner, for example, is almost worships her because she is that much more white than Mrs. Turner is, and that fairness seems to play a big role in her fascination, where I'm thinking of the court scene where I guess her lawyer shuts up the people in the gallery, the black people who are trying to say a word, and he kind of silences them. Talk about, you know, suppressing the voice. They don't get to speak, but everyone is very anxious to hear what she has to say, because there's a sense that
I think mulatto is getting into a very interesting area. I just want to say that if you are a black person in this culture, almost everybody is mixed, and a lot of white people too. Right. Some even that don't even know. Right. And so my great-grandfather owned the hardware store, Old Man Hayes. He was white, but I don't look white, so I don't go around telling people I'm mixed. Right. And so I find that whole discussion, I think what it is about that woman is she was gorgeous. Mm-hmm. She was just like drop dead, like, because that other woman in the muck, she was not gorgeous. I don't care how light she was, okay? So it has nothing to do, I mean, she was just beautiful. And you know, she makes us know she's beautiful by how people look at her. You're looking for more cues. How was she beautiful? But it's not that. You learn she's beautiful by how people react, which is very powerful.
Well, we know about her hair, though.
Her hair, yeah.
Okay, we know about her hair. That's right. She gives us one thing, but
hair's long.
Yeah.
And it's straight, and it's also, it's always described in phallic terms, actually, if you go back. It is. And Jody insists that she keep, it covered.
Yeah.
So this is another very important thing, because there was part of this sort of mesmerizing effect that her beauty has comes from that hair. It's also straight and so forth. Anyway, you can go ahead. So
there was.
Hi.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I'm actually named after Zora Neale Hurston, so I was really excited to come and see her, to talk about her. But so yes, my name is Zora. My question was about how do you think her definition of marriage changed over the course of the book? So in comparison to the beginning of the book when she's like under the pear tree and stuff, as compared to like when she comes home, what do you think she thinks marriage is when she comes home, when she's walking down the street?
What do you think?
Yeah.
I knew you were gonna ask me that, but
Go ahead.
I want you to tell me what you think.
No, you tell. Your name is
You're
Zora.
Zora.
You tell us.
Well, okay, fine. I
And
guess.
stand up.
Okay. Hello. So I guess it was kind of going back to what you were saying about I think for her marriage is something that fits. Marriage is something that's, I don't know, like, I guess it's not going to be perfect, but I like what you said about it just fitting, being satisfying, not necessarily perfect,
Enough.
but satisfying. Yeah, enough. That's why I felt like she, at least when she's walking back, having walked all that time, that's how I felt that she thought it would, like, that's how I think she thinks of marriage now, like, after going through everything, after idealizing it for so long, and then having what she thought was about to be ideal be gone, like, it's just enough. That's how I see her as seeing marriage, but I'm not sure.
One of the things I thought about was this whole idea, and that's part of it, outside was beauty, is this your inside feeling. You know how she said, I'm going to fix my face for that funeral, but inside I'm like flying? And for me, at the end of the book, her inside and outside became more the same. So she was satisfied to be wherever she was and to have those overalls on. And just, so to me, that's what it is, what she learned to match her inside and outside. Not just being defined by something. And she talks about often, that was my inside and this is the outside. I heard it throughout the book.
Right in the back. Is there a mic back there? Yeah.
Hi, circling back to what Ms. Alita had mentioned about white men and black women are the only ones that are free, because I do not have a clue how to interpret that. Could you speak to that, or perhaps someone in the audience speak to that?
You know, the reason why I brought it up is that I really think it's open. I would like to hear too.
Maybe Mr. Wolf could speak to that?
A man of his own gender.
I don't know. I don't know what to say in response to that. I don't really understand what's meant by that.
Well, somewhere I was hearing that sometimes in the black community, like in the women could often get hired, at least get jobs as domestics and things like that, or sometimes in stores and all that. And then a lot of times the men wouldn't so easily be able to get a job anywhere. You know, when it came to getting jobs in the white community and all that. So that may be some tie-in with that, if you think about it.
So
Can we do just one more, two more?
yeah,
Couple
we'll
more?
take
Do you have something?
two more.
Two more.
Two more.
I had been puzzling over where that title came from, and there's a quote in the book that when Janie is talking to her friend Phoebe, she says, your papa and your mama and nobody else can't tell you and show you. Two things everybody's got to do for themselves. They got to go to God, and they got to find out about living for themselves. Well, I think Janie is watching God when she's under that pear tree, and she gets a very strong sense of who she is at that moment that is successively squelched and squoze out of her until finally at the end she does come home as a real self. So that's
Okay, in the back.
And I came back to a quote that's, my edition's older, so it's not exactly the same page, but it's during the flood, and it seems like there are these limit situations. Like somebody, I think even you've said this, Robert, in a lecture, that tragedy was the highest form of wisdom for the Greeks. But it seems like that also, so that goes for Zora Neale Hurston too, but there are these moments, limit situations, during the flood, when she says they need to put down their cards or put down the game because the massa is doing his work now, with the H with a capital, and us gotta keep quiet. And so they huddled close to the door, and they're inside the door, and 6 eyes were questioning God. And then Tea Cake is worried. He says, well, you're gonna be mad that I brought you out here to this little shack. And she says, no, we've been together around 2 years. Forgive me if I can't, I don't know if I can perform the dialect. But if you concede the light at daybreak, you don't care if you die at dusk. It's so many people never seen the light at all. I was fumbling around and God opened the door. And he says, and he's satisfied. He's like, I never knowed you was so satisfied with me.
He thinks he's God.
And so, because at first, you know, if it might have, and it goes on. He says they're straining against their walls, and their souls are asking if he meant to measure their puny might against his. They seemed to be staring at the dark, but their eyes were watching God. So there was this moment, extreme moment. And then there's another quote about love, and that's her last wisdom that she passes on to Phoebe. And the end, she seems to return to that light that she mentions here. So I don't know if I've come any closer to the answer, if anybody else has, but I did have a technical question. Who was her, who were her contemporaries besides, I know the men, like I'm thinking Langston Hughes, Richard Wright. Were there any women writers in the 30s? Black women? Or was she the only one?
Well, I'm sure she's not, but we don't know.
Yeah.
It's not
She
possible.
was the main woman, black woman writer of her whole generation, for sure. Known, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And what I.
Her interest is so different from Richard Wright's interest.
Yeah.
It doesn't surprise me that you didn't like her work. They're totally different.
Yeah.
I just want to go back to something you said. I feel like when she talks about the way their eyes were watching God, I feel like she's talking about the way that black people think about God. Not everybody, but there's this way in which it's kind of personal. Like the way she describes it, you will hear people say like, well, that's if it's God's will, or talking about it in that same way now. But that's that church I go to. Part of the service is praise report, where you stand up and say what God did for you that week. Just like that. Like he came and opened the door, and I got a job last week. Like that way of looking at God as being a part of just God got in touch with Cynthia Haven and asked me to do this. That would be a praise report.
Yeah, and one thing that struck me when you were reading from the text is that there's a line early on in the book where Janie speaks about words walking without masters. And although this is out of context, I got a sense that maybe the Richard Wrights and Langston Hughes, many writers write with a master looking over their shoulder, but it seemed to me that this prose seemed to have these words that were walking without masters, and maybe that's the answer how she could write a book in 7 weeks like that. Is that there was no superego, looking over her shoulder in this regard.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank you all for coming again, and we look forward to seeing you again in the winter quarter. Thank our guests here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Alita, this is lovely.